embedded within that report, and how are we going to coordinate as civil society organizations and the government to ensure that these recommendations actually come to light in that regard through various implementations. Well, we do know that in 2020 there was a lot of enforced disappearances that took center stage. That is the NUP supporters who were, rounded up by members of security, the Chieftaincy of Military Intelligence that was headed by the former leader, that is Abel Kandiho, who is now the Chief of Staff within the Uganda Police. Many of these individuals have not been seen again within the public. Others are still nursing wounds, and those who died have not been compensated, or their families haven't been compensated in that regard. So a slew of recommendations were actually embedded within our national report, and would like to know what are those. I do have the Executive Director for the National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders in Uganda, that is none other than Robert Chirenga, and he's here with us within the studio. He's not alone. We also have Ms. Fiona Wall. She is the President of the Uganda Law Society, and we shall also hear it from the Uganda Human Rights Commission. They are going to be sending Ruth Sechindi to speak to us on that issue. She is the Director of Monitoring and Inspections at the Uganda Human Rights Commission. Let me kick off with the two guests that I have so far in studio right now, Fiona Wall and Robert Chirenga. Robert Chirenga and Fiona Wall, thank you for joining us right here on this show. Indeed.
Thank you very much.
Let me start with you, Robert Chirenga. The Universal Periodic Review. This is our third cycle, but I could tell you for a fact there are some Ugandans who do not know what the Universal Periodic Review is or what it is all about. So in tandem, what is the Universal Periodic Review, UPR?
Thank you, Romeo. The UPR basically refers to what we call the Universal Periodic Review. It is a mechanism for protecting and promoting human rights on the global scale.
I see.
So member states of the United Nations in their General Assembly set up what we call the Human Rights Council in 2006. That Human Rights Council was given a task to come up with a mechanism in which all countries, member states, would be assessed on how they are fulfilling their human rights obligations. So every cycle, we have a cycle which is made of 4 years. Countries appear at different cycles.
So when we established the Human Rights Council in 2006,
yes,
that's when we created the UPR.
That's when the UPR came into force as a mechanism through a resolution of the Human Rights Council.
So why did Uganda take long to join? It took us a decade. That is 10 years.
Yes, because it was a new mechanism. Countries had to acclimatize themselves on how they will be conducting their report, in terms of compiling the report on how they're fulfilling their human rights obligations. So it took time in terms of providing technical assistance to member states on how this cycle, because it was the first, and that's why it's referred to as a unique mechanism, where all countries are treated equally. That the United States and a small country like Tuvalu is treated as equal countries. So that's how it took some time for them to really understand how will this mechanism operate, and of course putting into other systems like procedures. When does one country report, and when is the next report? And that's why it's a 4-year cycle reporting. And
indeed, you did mention that we joined in 2016, but we've still suffered with more problems, like enforced disappearances. You do remember in 2020, many of the NUP supporters were rounded up, 54 people were killed in 2020, and so forth that did happen. So a viewer who is watching this show right now is wondering, what is the significance of this UPR? Now that we are being judged by the UPR, but still the human rights violations are persisting, but still the army and police are the #1 human rights violators within Uganda, despite having undergone 3 cycles. Robert?
Sure, but I think there's been some progress made in terms of how do you hold states to account. The mere fact that the country alone participates in this process is, for me, progress. All you need to, yes, it is progress. The mere fact that a country goes and explains what it has been able to do and what it has not been able to do, and also allowing participation. The mere fact that we are here talking about it on a live studio is an achievement in itself. Some member countries, member states do not even discuss the way we're discussing these things. So it's progress. The whole thing is, how do we address these challenges that continue to come? Issues of enforced disappearances. The more you put pressure on the state, the more it responds and says, how can we handle this? And I think it's on record that government of Uganda, when it appeared in the 3rd cycle, acknowledged the arrests and even apologized where things went beyond, especially where there were deaths occurred during the November riots. So for me, it makes its progress. It may be slow progress, but it's better than no progress. So the issue is, how do we continuously ask government to live up to its expectations of respecting, protecting and fulfilling human rights.
And of course, let's break down the significance of this UPR so that the viewer can actually understand how crucial it is for the UPR mechanism to actually be very, very much alive in every country or UN member state.
Sure. Because no any other mechanism, there is no any other mechanism.
It's the only one that exists.
Yeah, that you can equate where all countries are put to task on what are your commitments, what are those voluntary commitments that you've made, especially when you ratify international human rights treaties. What have you done beyond ratification?
Indeed.
Then that's how states explain. And I think the more we continue engaging states and civil society participating in this, then you will likely to be seeing these improvements. It may take some time, but it will certainly come to a point where you'll see that, yes, there is progress that we can realize. It's a different matter where you have states who do not account to anybody.
Indeed.
Yeah.
There are some people like the satirical novelist, Mr. Rukirabashaija, who was actually whipped when he was in custody and recently fled to Germany. He said he thought his case actually was going to be the turning point of torture in Uganda. He thought maybe it was going to be used as an example to actually clamp down on issues of torture within Uganda. But even that did not actually change anything within Uganda. Are you really sure the UPR is actually having an effect on how things are being done within Uganda?
We could do an assessment from the time the country joined this mechanism and see how much progress has been made and what has not been. But when you single out a case of Rukirabashaija, that's true. What happened to him was not a good thing. And I don't think government itself is happy with the fact that he had to go to exile. And these are issues I don't think that they would want to have another Rukirabashaija leave this country or have someone subjected to such kind of inhuman, degrading treatment. It goes back. The more you highlight such issues, I think the state will have to reconsider its position on issues of torture. Because recall that we have the most comprehensive legal regime when it comes to torture. That is more comprehensive than even the international instruments. Because the international instrument is so restrictive on the definition of torture that torture can only be done by an officer of government in its official capacity. But our laws recognize that even private individuals like Romeo can torture an individual. So
and
when
they
you
can be held liable.
Yes, can be held.
But that's not what we saw in 2020, because it is Abel Kandiho who superintended the torture cases that were taking place within the country at the time. But he was never penalized, and the man is the chief of staff in the Uganda police.
That's the contradiction.
Not a promotion, but he
that's
was
the contradiction that we need now to start focusing on, and that's why you saw international actors had to come in. That is on a sanctions list.
Indeed.
So I think the more we continue raising these issues, I think the state will have to see how to respond in a better way and say torture should be prohibited. Because as I've told you, we have a real comprehensive legal regime.
Indeed.
But it's one thing to have a legal regime and another thing to implement what is in the
So implementation in this case is the problem. Let me also bring in Fiona Wall. She is the president of the Uganda Law Society to talk about the legal perspective when it comes to torture and many of these enforced disappearances. The subject at hand, the Universal Periodic Review. Fiona Wall, what is access to justice? Let's start from there.
I would simply define access to justice as how fast, how quickly you can access either a court of law or a medium within which your dispute can be resolved, within which your rights can be defined, pronounced, and enforced. Yeah.
Well, at this point, we are not seeing, very, very quick access to justice in that regard. The victims of the 2020 brutality of the Uganda police and also other security agencies have never received compensation up to date. But someone lied in the national report that was submitted in January that government actually compensated all victims of torture within this country, something that was disputed by members of the opposition and some of the journalists that were actually roughed up during that period. I remember Ashraf from Ghetto Media was roughed up. There is Carlton Scovia. She was also roughed up. But in the report, they claim these individuals were actually compensated. When we spoke to the individuals, they say, no, none of that money came through. So the issue of access to justice, it's been actually stalling or dilly-dallying on the part of the government. Talk to us about that.
I think access to justice, without just narrowing down on something like that, I don't really have the facts. I cannot make judgment on that issue. But what I can say is that...
but I'm sure you might be having some facts on the Rwenzururu problem. You remember in Kasese, when citizens were killed there?
Yes.
Yes. Have they received compensation up to now? So that's what we are talking about.
Romeo,
Indeed.
Well,
it's a special 2016
you've asked a question now where we're going into so many things. Yes. What I want to say is that there are 4 tenets that I'd look at for access to justice. One, is it timely? Is it accessible to everybody? Is it within the law? You know, and do people know their rights? Do they know where to get justice from? Do they, and as a country, I think this particular, I'll say 3 years, we've not done very well. You've talked about the enforced disappearances, you've talked about the Rwenzururu issues, but we also have, we've had some even consistencies in the way access to justice institutions have been run. I think we spent about 1.5 years without a functional IGG, without a functional Human Rights Commission, without a functional, we had acting ministers of justice, you know, and I think that these 3 things really weighed heavily on access to justice within the country. We have those people you're talking about that were not compensated. You might find their cases are piling up in Human Rights Commission. The commission right now is overwhelmed by the amount of backlog. We have DGF being suspended for 1.5 years or 2 years, and yet we know that it has carried a lot of government access to justice and governance work for a long time. So even these institutions I'm talking about that didn't have substantive leaders also did not have the substantive funding that they've been getting, for instance, from DGF. And now as we speak, it's closing. As Uganda Law Society, the pro bono, you know, one of our biggest mandates is increasing access to justice. And we do this through a legal aid project in 24 districts in Uganda. But we also use our advocates. We have about 2,500 advocates providing pro bono services through the pro bono
services. Nice.
Free legal services, yes. Pro bono services through the pro bono project. Now this pro bono project is 100% funded by DGF. So now it's been on suspension for 2 years, has put us in limbo. There's institutions that are probably going to have to close.
Yes. Some have closed
and
already.
yet we exist in a government, in a jurisdiction where government has not accorded financing to increasing access to justice the way they should. They've mostly left this to donor funding. Now the donor funding is compromised, so we are in a bit of a problem. We have a legal aid bill that has been stuck on the shelves of Parliament for 12 years now, and the problem was because government did not want to commit funds to this issue. So we brought it in, as we and other actors brought it in as a private member's bill, and just recently, we had some progress where we got the certificate of financial implication, but we were shocked and flabbergasted to find that it's going to be 0 on government.
Wow. And
yet, you know, the Constitution already talks about this. We have a national legal aid policy that we're looking into making, you know, making real. And when you look at the access to justice commitments that have been taken on by Uganda, this bill would be one of the biggest way of implementing this. In doing the financials some years back, about 2 years ago, they said the implication on government for every Ugandan that deserves it to get access to justice through legal aid, some public defender project, would be about 17 billion annually. That is for 50 million people. Now, we need to just do a little math here. I mean, how much is spent on national environment celebrations, you know, in this country? You understand? So if we got 17 billion, and we've always said as legal aid actors that we do not have to get it in a bunch. We can say that this year we're committing 2 billion, the next year like that. And we need to look at it, we need to look at the budgeting process and look at these commitments we've made, because the budgeting process has already started, these commitments that we've made on access to justice, and make them a reality.
Indeed.
It's as Robert has said, we have the best laws, you know, we have the best legislations on paper, but we lack the commitment to implement them. The other aspect of access to justice that I am also looking at is the freedom of expression issue. We have the Computer Misuse Act. We've had, as Uganda Law Society, we've had issues, and now this is where we talk about access to justice, because in when the Computer Misuse Act came out, a lot of people went to court on it, and in 2019, Uganda Law Society we put in our case, and it's been going on, and we had reached judgment level, and then somebody, you know, in the judiciary said, no, we're going to now merge these cases with the others and start the case afresh.
Indeed.
Now, what does that mean? And as we are speaking, someone brings another bill to Parliament to even strengthen the clauses in the bill that we feel should actually be removed.
I see.
So that is going to shrink the space more for communication, for accountability. The other thing that we need to look at... So the shrinking
civic space is going to get narrower.
Yes. And we also we're looking at legislation that is also shrinking again the space further.
I see.
When you look at the NGO environment, the NGO governance environment, and we look at the fact that the NGOs and the civil society organizations have been the strongest, should I say, arm of government. They've been the hands and legs of government when it comes to increasing access to justice for minorities, for the indigent, for the people that cannot afford it, for the poor.
But what we are seeing on the ground is the government looking at these organizations as the enemy. Like in 2021, they shut down 54 NGOs.
That's where I'm headed.
Indeed.
So you see that now they're shutting down the NGOs. Then when you go deeper, you find that even the regulatory environment for them to be licensed is so onerous. It takes, recently somebody gave me a good laugh. It took them a whole year to be able to qualify to get that certification. And now they've taken the whole year that they were applying, and now they have to start again. So we need to look at, is the law for the people, or are the people for the law?
Indeed.
And that is going to tell us to what extent access to justice is a reality. Now, the thing with the UPR, the main aim of the UPR is for us to account, is for us to evaluate our performance, is for us to make commitments according to how much cloth we have to cut our cloth, you know, and then to deliver services. And when I look at these commitments, they're huge. We've talked about legal protection to victims of sexual and gender-based violence by increasing the number of emergency shelters. We have an issue. We have these girls who are pregnant, who are impregnated. We had about 38,000 Ugandan girls in the months between March and May 2020. But when you look at those figures, the question is, yes, they're there. Yes, Ministry of Education has accepted for them to go to school and everything. But who has been brought to justice? Actually,
after those 2 years, we counted 600,000 impregnated young girls.
So what are we doing to deter these people that are abusing these children? What are we doing? Is there a safe space? Is there a government program that is educating people not to defile children or not, or to report cases, or that this is not normal? Do we have serious programs where government is putting money to discourage child marriages? Are we doing deterrent things like actually prioritizing, doing I want to applaud the judiciary. Recently they did an SGBV session. We should have more sessions like this and prioritize the cases where these children have reported. But have we put out a national helpline, a national center to deal with young children, so that they know that they can report to this place, they can get a counseling? These girls are not being cancelled. So we have traumatized children going to raise children, and in a country where 50% of our population is under 15, that's a huge issue, a huge access to justice issue that we need to look at. And when I look at the commitments within here, there's many places we could fulfill that, but let's start with the budgeting and Ministry of Education. Let's start with, is there a register of sexual offenders? Because we also have schools. I think you saw St. Lawrence. We have schools where teachers are repeat offenders, and they just keep being moved by government, on the government payroll, from one school to the other. So these are some of the things that I look at, and I think that access to justice is very much still a dream for a lot of Ugandans.
It's very much still a dream, and in tandem, well, this is the $64,000 question, Fiona. What is the state of access to justice in Uganda?
It's still in the red. First of all, I've talked about the funding, sustainability, going forward. We're doing badly. The people that have been supporting us are leaving. We also have the NGOs and civil society that have been helping. The space is shrinking. There's a lot of intimidation in that area. There's a lot of uncertainty, and nobody wants to be in those spaces. And then we have the government making a very big statement in that certificate of financial implication that they don't want to get involved. So we need to do something further. For instance, the Human Rights Commission now has to be more innovative and maybe form regional or district tribunals, so that they need to find a way of delegating, amending their law and delegating some of these powers, because all these cases of about 5 years cannot wait for them now. And lastly, when it comes to the facts, only about 5 to 6% of Ugandans can access a court of law in Uganda.
Only
I want to applaud, there's been some good developments. We have the Judiciary Administration Act that now has enabled the judiciary to have its own budget. As we speak, they're trying to make sure that every sub-county has a court. Now that will increase the number of people that can access courts. But at the same time, we still have a DPP that's heavily understaffed, and we need that to be worked on. That is why the country also needs legal aid, because yes, you're going to have all these people entering all these courts, but if they have no representation, it's not access to justice. So we do need the legal aid bill to pass through. We need government to commit money to it before even the Judiciary Administration Bill, Act in its enforcement and implementation can be relevant at all.
All right, that is Ms. Fiona Wall, the president of the Uganda Law Society. We also do have Mr. Robert Chirenga, the executive director for the National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders in Uganda. Well, we are talking about the Universal Periodic Review. It is a unique process that involves a review of the human rights records of various UN member states. And Uganda is one of those UN member states, and we've undergone our third cycle of the Universal Periodic Review starting in 2016. So we did actually accept 200, there were actually 270 recommendations. We accepted only 138 recommendations, and we only took note of 132 recommendations. So we would like to know what were some of those recommendations we actually adopted or accepted, and what were those that were simply taken note of. Robert, what were some of those recommendations we accepted as a country?
Thank you, Romeo. I think we did, the government of the Republic of Uganda accepted or supported recommendations relating to strengthening the national human rights institution, that's the Uganda Human Rights Commission, in terms of also putting in place mechanisms, laws and policies that are supposed to protect vulnerable people, like people with disabilities, women and children. including laws and policies that are supposed to cater or to tackle trafficking, child trafficking. They also accepted recommendations related to maternal health and reproductive health. There are also recommendations relating to education,
I see.
the right to education, to put in place mechanisms that would promote the right to education, and also increasing policies and implementing the business and human rights policy.
Yeah.
Those are among the many policies. There are many recommendations that the Republic of Uganda
Did we accept the recommendation on enforced disappearances? Because that is crucial to members of the opposition, especially those of the National Unity Platform Party and also the Forum for Democratic Change.
Unfortunately,
they bore the brunt of police military brutality within this country.
Ukraine, as a member state of the United Nations, was one of those countries that recommended the need to investigate cases related to enforced disappearances, and unfortunately the government of the Republic of Uganda rejected it. But good enough is that the Republic of Russia, the Russian Federation, made recommendations that government of Uganda should put in laws and policies that would protect and promote human rights. And the government accepted that recommendation.
Laws we never implement.
So you could use the recommendation that Russia sent in and was accepted in terms of strengthening human rights. And law enforcement, enforced disappearance is a human rights violation. So we could use that recommendation and say we need to see this happening. And that's the beauty of the UPR. That you will get a recommendation accepted, rather rejected or taken note of, but you look at another recommendation that will be accepted that will help you achieve the other that was rejected or not supported. Did
we also accept the recommendation of the shrinking civic space? The Human Rights Council is concerned about the shrinking civic space. You do have the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and she's actually concerned. Very, very, very concerned, especially now that officials are sending lies to the Human Rights Council and they are saying victims of torture have been compensated, yet that is not the truth on the ground. So in that respect, talk to us about that.
All recommendations related to civic space, human rights defenders, protection of human rights defenders were all taken note.
So what does that mean when they take note?
It's a diplomatic way of saying we rejected these recommendations.
In a kind way.
And you know the UPR basically is a diplomatic process. And now it's up to us really to continue advocating and urging government to reconsider its position on some of these recommendations in case they are raised again in the next cycle.
Well, what are some of those compelling recommendations that will actually help this country that we accepted, in your opinion?
I think we need to face reality. The issue of enforced disappearance is a serious issue. If people can no longer track or trace their loved ones as a result of a political question we're addressing in 2021, that's an election, it is important that government reviews this and see where, because about 332 persons were availed to Parliament, the parliamentary committee by the National Union Platform Party, saying these are their members who are disappearing. And to the best of my knowledge, I think the Human Rights Commission also published them in their most recent report on the state of human rights. So it would be important that they address this issue and have closure so that it doesn't repeat, and to address the very cause. Why should we have enforced disappearances in this country where the Constitution allows you freedom of association, freedom of expression? It would be necessary that they really address them as opposed to burying them under the carpet.
This is the most crucial recommendation I read from the Human Rights Council. They say that we need to stop these enforced disappearances, but above all, the General Court-Martial. The General Court-Martial, civilians shouldn't be in there. Civilians shouldn't be tried within the General Court-Martial. Did we accept that recommendation? You've had Kizza Besigye in there, you've had NUP supporters in there, General Court-Martial, many other civilians being tried in a General Court-Martial. Did we accept that recommendation? And if we didn't, what would be the ramifications of that decision?
I think they never accepted the recommendation to do that, and it wasn't speaking specific to the institution of the Court-Martial. But all they were talking about is access to justice, and I think we have a constitutional court ruling that no civilians shall be tried
in the court martial.
In the court martial.
Uganda Law Society.
Even after that constitutional ruling, Besigye was tried in a general court martial, courtesy of the late General Tumwine. Eli Tumwine, may his soul rest in peace. Go ahead.
Sure. So these are the issues that we still need to continue engaging with the state and say, look, if we are to observe the rule of law, we need to avoid such instances happening. And that's why I was telling that, well, as you may say, the UPR may not be making as much progress as you said. The mere fact the UPR gives us a platform to continuously raise these issues. And engage with state actors and also other international partners. Because these are recommendations that are brought by member states. If you have accepted to be peer reviewed, this is something that you need to. And as we continue raising these issues, I think the state will have to reconsider its stance on this and see how to reform.
Robert, what happens when a country refuses to actually adhere to the accepted recommendations or to implement them? What happens?
Right now, as we do, I don't think there's anything they can do apart from if there's consistent non-cooperation. Consistent non-cooperation with the UPR mechanism would mean that eventually the Human Rights Council may take action. What is the action? They may refer the matter to the UN Security Council, but that's very rare. That's extremely rare. So what will remain will be mentioning you in the sessions, and I don't think countries would want to be mentioned in the Human Rights Council session as a country which is violating or not respecting the rule of law and so on. So countries will try to avoid, but you also know that the Human Rights Council is also political. Member states who constitute the 43 regional body are countries whose human rights records is also questionable.
Indeed.
So it's also politics, geopolitics. The state of Uganda can accept a recommendation from another country which maybe has good relations with it, but a similar recommendation by another country in the European Union will not be accepted. So sometimes you see geopolitics at play within the UN system itself. But there is a mechanism where states can be tasked under the Human Rights Council too.
Well, satirical novelist Kakwenza Rukirabashaija says, well, since Uganda has persistently violated human rights, we should be expelled from the United Nations. Can that be an option?
No. I don't think there's anything like expulsion. There could be, at the worst case scenario, would be sanctions.
I see.
But sanctions would really also take if you really understand how the Security Council operates with the power of veto, it would be very hard for such a subject matter to be tabled before the Human Rights Council. Rather, the Security Council. It would take strides. It has happened in Ukraine. The conflict in Ukraine was raised before the Human Rights, before the Security Council, and you know that states vetoed it and could not go beyond that. Yeah, so we also have to take into consideration the geopolitics and what happens at such international arenas.
All right, that is Robert Chirenga, the Executive Director for the National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders in Uganda. Let's also indulge Fiona Wall, the President of the Uganda Law Society. Now, Fiona, on the issue of justice delayed is justice denied, you and I know that for a fact. The Uganda Human Rights Commission, it wasn't fully constituted, so they didn't have quorum to actually deploy their tribunal and hear cases, but now they are fully constituted and so forth. But still, Ruth Sechindi, the Director of Monitoring and Inspections, came here on this show and she told us, well, they were grappling with a case backlog, and she said the issue of enforced disappearances in 2020 and everything that surrounded that election won't be handled until at least 2025. Can we afford not to have closure for these individuals until the next electoral cycle? And what would be the direct implications of that delayed justice on our citizens?
I think, as we've said, if it's delayed, then it's denied. These people have already suffered a delay of about 2 years. We also realized that these were unique. This was a very unique situation. I think it was sort of unprecedented.
Unprecedented, yes.
And because of that, I think it would be I do not think it would cost the Human Rights Commission anything or that it would take away anything from their mandate to prioritize such a case. It's just the way even our constitution says that electoral petitions should be prioritized and finished within the first 6 months, because the implications of the things that come out of an election, if they go on for too long and almost going to the next election, it causes a lot of issues. It even delegitimizes some of the things that are going to happen in 2026. So that, in my opinion, is something for the Commission to prioritize here, and after dealing with this, then we move on as a country. The country needs to move on from this. And as Robert said, we need closure. The victims need closure, their families need closure, but the country at large needs closure. Even the international community that is observing this needs closure. The other thing also that we need to think about is the electoral reforms that we talked about.
Indeed.
That were recommended by the Supreme Court in 2016.
That was the ruling.
These recommendations were not implemented by the last election, and although we really wished that...
What were some of those recommendations?
Some of these recommendations were re-evaluating what's happening with the constitution of the Electoral Commission itself.
Yes, all right.
Some of these recommendations included how can I say?
The incumbency also.
Yes. How do you deal the incumbency, but also strengthening the competitors, the parties, and everything, and redefining what are they called? The election. What are they?
The electoral laws.
The constituencies. Yes. Redefining the constituencies, the rules, but also looking at the composition of the Electoral Commission, how are they appointed, who appoints them.
Wow.
You know, these are
things that we
recommendation
to have the Judicial Service Commission actually do that.
Do the appointment. So these are the...
And we've also called for the
these
same
are the
as
reforms we want. Now, as a country, we sat back and waited until like a week, okay, not a week, a year before elections, and then started agitating for the reforms. These reforms require legislative reform. They require budgetary, they have huge budgetary implications. As a country, we could not have done that before 2020 if we started agitating around 2019. So, and then also I think what further made it a fiasco is that the opposition, who are strongly opposed to having an election without the reforms, took part in the election.
Legitimizing the
exactly. So then we have this situation.
There was that issue of equal access to the TV stations.
So even as we look at the UPR, I think as a country we need to remember that there are certain things we need to take charge of ourselves and stop waiting for the outside world to remind us, and that includes making these reforms a reality now. We're in a budgeting process. I'm asking Ugandans to look into that, the ministries, look into that and budget and prepare for these reforms. Let's not remember in 2024, even the opposition, I'm calling them out. I'm saying, please do not wait for 2024 to make noise.
Put government on pressure.
Exactly,
right
but
now.
also government itself has a lot to benefit from these reforms. So, because it increases the legitimacy of elections, it increases the transparency, the accountability in this process, and any government would want that for their reputation.
But here we are in 2021, and 2020, of course, the campaigns. We did see radio stations being switched off. We did see TV stations being told, please don't host this person, against the recommendations of the Supreme Court ruling in 2016.
But you see, it's because
now that government is silent, aren't you afraid that we are headed for the same cycle in 2026?
Exactly, but you see, Romeo, in my opinion,
yes, Fiona,
we contribute to all these things, all of us. It's not just government. We have a government we know does certain things a certain way towards elections. We have an opposition also that does certain things a certain way towards elections.
Indeed.
I want us to stop saying the government, the opposition. I want us to say, as a country, this is what we want. And I remember coming out of 2016, everybody agreed that those reforms were healthy for this country.
Indeed.
And they are still on record. It's still a Supreme Court ruling. So what we need is to actually see a deliberate move towards those reforms, deliberate dialogue towards those reforms, and because that will paint a picture. And I think I've had the Minister of Justice, Honorable Norbert Mao, talk about the fact that 2026 has to be different, and we have to start now in trying to make it look different. we get lost in a lot of things, and then elections find us, and
unprepared.
then yes, unprepared always. So we need to stop being schizophrenic again.
Indeed.
And I think even the fourth estate, you're almost 80% responsible for our short memories.
Indeed.
Because
For
you
NMG,
distract
it's
us from what
100%.
matters.
We ensure that we bring back those conversations in your faces.
So
that
what we want
indeed
you to do is keep these conversations going.
alive, yeah.
Don't wait to wake them up.
And of course, that is an appeal we always renew and pledge to our viewers that we shall continue, yes, to actually bring you that information that you really clamor for in an undeterred manner. All right, let's also bring in Mr. Robert Chirenga. We've been actually reviewed 3 times at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Are you seeing any changes when it comes to the advancement of human rights within Uganda, especially now that we submitted our, report, January 2022?
Yes. There are quite some positive steps that you see, especially when it comes to socio-economic rights. The state is committed in terms of addressing issues to do with maternal health, issues addressing poverty, because poverty is a human rights issue, whatever the challenges, but you see some commitments. Where I see challenges, it comes to civil liberties.
Civil liberties.
Civil liberties, which don't require resources in terms of financial resources. Yeah,
so there's no excuse.
They shouldn't be really excused. Look at the issue of law enforcement in terms of enforced disappearances. If you have arrested people during a political debates or during when addressing a political question like the elections we had, and it is now over a year you've not taken them to a court of law, release them. If they're criminals, they're bound to commit another offense within the next 1 week, and you'll arrest them and have them tried. So there are issues where you see that we've made progress as a country. The mere fact, and I always say it, although people downplay it, the act of participating in the UPR itself is a plus.
It is. Because
you allow yourself to be subjected to scrutiny. You committed yourself to do A, B, C, D. How far have you gone? And the your recommendations are never thrown away. You may accept or you may take note of a recommendation today. Tomorrow, in the next cycle, it will reappear. So if you don't want it to reappear, you address it. You address it because it will reappear as long as the problem is still persistent.
I see.
It's still, if issues of enforced disappearance, it would be good to be addressed before the next election because enforced disappearances happened during an election year.
Go ahead.
So it would be important that really the state addresses this issue and we have closure before the 2026. You either release them or take them to the courts of law and have them.
When it comes to effective implementation of these recommendations of the UPR, we really need the government, the state, you understand, to work with the civil society organizations. But we are seeing a shrinking civic space. We are seeing the friendship between the CSOs and government actually narrowing and becoming worse, deteriorating further. So how are you going to implement these recommendations when you are at loggerheads with the central government? Others have been suspended, others closed indefinitely, others are still in the crosshairs with the same central government. So how are you going to come together, operate as one fold to actually implement these recommendations?
That's very true, Robert, and that's the biggest contradiction.
Indeed.
If you look at the theme for the UPR today, is that we're talking about a collective and coordinated action in implementing recommendations. Recall that the UPR is a state-driven
process,
mechanism. So we, as civil society, come in to complement. And the principle behind the UPR is that really participation is key. So states are urged to work with civil society organizations. So
the big question here is how? How are you going to do it?
That's the thing. So we have to keep on continuously engage with government. Look, undermining civil society initiatives in terms of access to resources is shooting yourself
in the leg.
Because at the end of the day, you need civil society. Civil society has a big role. It contributes both to the economy and to also the general human rights situation in the country. In terms of our collective action, civil society contributes to revenue pass that goes to the consolidated fund. We do contribute in terms of employment levels, that they employ quite a number of people. Thirdly, we contribute to service delivery, where governments have not been able to do that. So it's important for the government to revisit its position on how much would you want civil society to contribute to the national development of this country in terms of a country's national priorities as they are defined in the NDP3, in terms of the constitutional provisions that talk about all these fundamental rights in Chapter 4. So when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, we are basically talking about human rights. There's nothing under the SDGs that's not human rights. So it is important that government recognizes that civil society plays an important role for it to realize the SDGs, including the National Development Plan 3.
But now they're acting like they do not need the CSOs with the advent of the closures that we saw last year. Can they really move on their own?
I highly doubt if they were to move on their own, they will realize the implications very soon, and it will be soon. Between now and the next financial year, we should be able to see the effect of denying civil society access to resources. That modality known as the funding modality known as the DGF contributed quite a lot to the national economy of this country. And you see soon, because it's now closing, a successor program is not yet in place.
I see.
And that's how you feel it in the next 6 months to 1 year, you'll see the implications of such actions.
I see. When we were reviewed in January of 2022, where we did speak to the Minister of, that is Foreign Affairs, that is General J.J. Odongo, and we also did speak to the Attorney General, Chiriwa Chiwanuka, on the issue of, well, human rights violations, enforced disappearances, but they gave us a clean bill. When it comes to all this, they said, well, none of that is happening in our country. We've actually given closure to many of the victims and so forth. But when you look at the recommendations within the UPR, do you see anything in there geared towards accelerating or promoting access to justice?
There's quite a lot on access to justice. I've told you, I've already mentioned SGBV. Mr. Chirenga has talked about the human rights institutions, strengthening them. There's also a lot that we've committed to on issues of children, children's rights, child trafficking, on issues on the even human trafficking. But when you talk about human rights, I think we also have made some progress. The fact that the Minister of Internal Affairs and the Attorney General have to make such statements also shows that they are under scrutiny, also shows that they know that one of their key result areas is to deliver in this element. These questions that are hanging over our heads of compensating those people, of making sure that this doesn't happen again. I think for me that's progress. As Uganda Law Society, one of the things we've done towards dealing with torture and the things that happened in 2020 has been not only just advocacy and talking about it. We've released reports, we've brought these people into the room and spoken to them. And I think our last effort has been to tell them, okay, so if our officers do not know the law, give us a chance to train them. So as I speak, we've done 4 trainings.
You're retooling them?
Yeah, so we're retooling them in human rights, in due process.
How is that coming along?
We've done trainings with CID top management and officers on this. We've also done trainings with the UPDF. And the trainings are revealing a lot of things. First of all, there's been a lot of laws, amendments, and what do you call it, jurisprudence that have come out that these people do not know much about, because maybe the last time they were in school, when they were being trained, the laws looked different. But issues like due process, you'd take it for granted that a policeman knows, but even you yourself need refresher courses. Even as lawyers, we have what we call continuous leading. So we've seen a lot of progress in the way people are thinking. We've not yet gone into a place where we can analyze what's happening. But the other thing we've also emphasized is accountability, and we've been talking to the UPDF consistently to bring out those officers who have been involved in these infractions. And I think General Goddard Sinje has now, he pledged in public to give this list to the Uganda Law Society. And one of the things we're also very glad about is the Human Rights Enforcement Act, because this act, Uganda Law Society held a conference and invited all these players to look at what does it mean. What does it imply for forces that are carrying out prosecutions through torture, you know? And we told them, you know, the law itself says that if there is torture, if there is evidence that there's been torture, you can pause a prosecution, deal with the torture, and you're more likely even to throw out the whole prosecution because of torture. And these are very sobering things to tell these officers. So having these conversations for us, we feel have
priorities are key. I like
beginning to have an impact, and it's also beginning to be our conversation, not ULS or the media against government. It is no, it's now a Ugandan conversation that if General Katumba Wamala's daughter was killed, and we want these people, we want these people to be apprehended, then torturing them is sabotaging that prosecution, is sabotaging any chance he has to get justice.
Any information you get out of a suspect who has undergone torture is null and void. Yeah,
so as Robert said, we have a very, very powerful and interesting, interestingly unique legal regime on torture in Uganda. And when we make our forces understand what that means, I'm hoping that we'll see a real change in the approach. Because you see, some of these things are done in silos. You know, when you think in silos, the corporal was told to get information at all costs. He's in his little room there. He doesn't understand the bigger picture.
I hear you.
The bigger picture that the prosecutor needs proper evidence that has been procured legally through a legal arrest, you know, through proper charges that are actually on the penal code, that unless that process is smooth there, they'll not have a conviction up there. So we need the officer in his police station to understand the bigger picture, that in order for General Katumba to get justice, this has to happen, starting from the investigations. So I think that we need, as civil society, as law society, we need to also grow the capacity of our forces to understand what we're talking about.
Indeed.
For a long time we've been yelling at them, but sometimes maybe we're yelling in a language they can't understand.
Indeed. And of course, the law on torture is very, very clear right here in Uganda. If you're nabbed when it comes to torture, you can actually serve 15 years, or there's a fine of 7.2 million Uganda shillings.
And the media needs to sell this information.
And indeed, or you can serve both, the 15 years and the 7.2 million Uganda shillings fine. For aggravated torture, you can spend the rest of your life in prison. So like she says, like Robert says, we really have good laws on torture, but are they being implemented? That is the $64,000 question. Robert Chirenga, I'm coming to you. Well, the purveyors of justice in Uganda are the biggest violators of the same human rights and so forth. I'm talking about the army and the Uganda police. Well, in light of all those facts that you have the army and the police as the biggest violators of human rights within Uganda, do you see a glimmer of hope when it comes to upholding human rights moving forward?
Yes, I am very optimistic because among those institutions you talk about, there are progressive forces there. And when you engage them, you have some ray of hope. Not everybody you see in uniform there has this animalish behavior of brutalizing people.
But every time we review, police and UPDF are way up there.
That's true, because that's the contradiction I was talking about.
So are we making strides?
We're making strides, but at a very slow rate.
I hear you.
We could do better. But I think the whole thing is the way our law enforcement does its work. There's a lot of politicking, mixing politics with the work of law enforcement. Especially when you look at elections. If you were to let the police do their work in terms of keeping law and order.
In a non-partisan way.
In a non-partisan way. I think they're able. They know what they should be done. But
instead of telling the police, Robert is using this route, stop him.
Exactly. The security of
Amoriat is in Gulu, stop him.
And then you have issues of the security of tenure.
I see.
The law enforcement is made to do what he would otherwise not have done because of this continuous involving of politics in the work of law enforcement. If you let the law enforcement do their professional work as they were trained to do, without witch hunting them for restricting themselves to the law, work would make progress. But the problem here we have is that you are involving politics in the work of law enforcement officers, and that's very dangerous.
So we should let institutions work.
Yes.
Build institutions that can live past you, who is in charge of them as a state. The challenge we have here is that we fail to differentiate the state from government. That the state are those few people, men and women, who control the instruments of coercion.
Indeed.
And when you control the instruments of coercion, it means you can make them do what they shouldn't have otherwise been doing. And that's where the challenge is, involving politics in the work of law enforcement.
I hear you.
We need to separate these things and make sure they should run. And that's how a country moves forward.
Speaking of institutions, Ms. Fiona Wall, how do
Yes.
you, as the Uganda Law Society, plan to work with the central government in this sphere of advancing access to justice?
We are already trying to work with them. For instance, in our commitments on business human rights, the Uganda Law Society has established 3 centers where we're giving not just, I told you we have 23 legal aid clinics for things like domestic violence and those kinds of and criminal cases. Now, the issue of business issues, we have huge injustices that came out, for instance, of the non-tariff barriers you saw between Uganda and Kenya, Ugandans pouring their milk because the market had been, you know, had been affected. We had the eggs, you know, all these things have serious legal implications, serious people's serious economic rights are being, you know, and they had nowhere to run. Because, of course, the lobbyist organizations also got a bit political.
I see.
And what we have done now is we've partnered with a private sector foundation. We've partnered with Buganda Kingdom for Central Region, and we've also partnered with DFC Women in Business. We're educating SMEs on their rights. One of the things we've found is that in order for Ugandans to compete on the international market, they need to formalize. They need to understand their legal rights. They need to build the compliance mechanisms in their institutions. And how we're doing that as lawyers, we have set up 3 centers to do this, to give advice, to help. We intend to set up more centers in the regions, and we hope that these centers will also be think tanks, because we've found that our policies that Uganda is signing on to the Common Market Protocol sometimes are not informed by data from our grassroots. So sometimes we are actually signing our people out of business. You know, you sign a standard that's impossible to achieve in Uganda because maybe of our soils, you don't have data, you don't have information, and you compromise the people of Uganda's rights. So we want to connect policy to the grassroots, and that's what we're doing. The other thing that we can do together with government, and Robert has raised it, is remind these officers every day of the law, of their calling. The most important thing in the Human Rights Enforcement Act is that now they've lifted the veil. You can no longer hide behind your uniform. You will be personally liable if you commit a crime as an officer of the law. And the public engagement, rule of law, we release rule of law, quarterly rule of law reports, and we release these reports in the presence of the government officials on whom we are reporting. And usually we make recommendations, and usually we follow it up with a visit from the President and the Council on how are we going to implement these recommendations. And we've had a lot of success. Would share some of those successes with you.
Indeed.
Lastly, I would say that we have also brought some champions on board. First of all, I think that having an active human rights lawyer and someone who even worked with the Uganda Law Society as our Minister of Justice is a big deal. And I think that having him there championing the right things, having the Attorney General who's been somebody in practice and understands these things, we are hoping will make a difference.
You're praying politics doesn't corrupt them or get in the way.
Yes, we
like
can only
Robert
hope.
said.
But also we have an increasingly, how can I say it, an increasingly informed population. I think the population can no longer just let institutions be there without working. We have serious governance issues in this country, and I think we've seen some of them.
Indeed.
But I want to applaud Parliament. I think Parliament lately has been really trying to bring out some of those issues. I think the funding to civil society being reduced is going to compromise our efforts on governance, but I believe that we should not stop talking. I think the media should not. And I think that we should not only report bad news, we should also applaud the institutions that are doing the right things.
And indeed.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Fiona Wall. And indeed, we do have some 20 seconds. Mr. Robert Chirenga, last pointers from the National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders, only 20.
Thank you, Romeo. I think we need, as a country, all citizens need to pick interest in the Universal Periodic Review.
Indeed.
Because in this you raise many pertinent issues that should go beyond the national level to the international arena.
Indeed.
Where even those who are responsible for contributing to our development effectiveness participate. So it will be key that this is also demystified to reach the local governments. Because there's nothing you can talk about development that does not include human rights.
Indeed.
Because development itself is a human right.
And on that note, we've come to the end of this conversation. My name is Romeo Busiku, and I've been your moderator for this conversation. And of course, we've had Robert Chirenga, the Executive Director for the National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders in Uganda, and also Fiona Wall. She is the President of the Ugandan Law Society. We've been talking about how best we can actually strike actions that could actually implement the Universal Periodic Review recommendations in that regard. I'm Romeo Busiku. Have a lovely day.